Welcome back to the Real News Network, and you're joining a discussion I'm having with Junaid S. Ahmad. Junaid is a director of the Center for Global Dialogue in Lahore, Pakistan, and is also a professor of law and politics at the University of Lahore. Thank you again for joining me, Junaid.
Great, good to be with you.
Junaid, in the first segment, you mentioned several times the conditions that ordinary Afghans are now living under after 14 years of occupation by the United States and NATO forces, that the situation isn't really any better for them. And I remember when President Obama first took office, he promised a social surge of humanitarian reconstruction and developments for the Afghani people. And has that transpired at all on the ground?
Oh, absolutely. This is the sad story of Afghanistan. In 2001, the situation was really bad under the Taliban regime, and whether it's the condition of women and the condition of the population generally, a horrible situation. And of course, while many of us were opposed to the war because we didn't think that that was the solution to what's going on, some of us did raise the question, well, if the US NATO occupation forces and that whole regime would have at least attempted to do massive reconstruction in the country, roads, hospitals, development, we could imagine large sections of the population may have welcomed it. But of course, that's not what happened. I think we live in neoliberal times, and there's not much reconstruction and development at home in the US itself, so not much of it's probably taking place elsewhere. And instead, what we saw was billions of dollars being siphoned into the coffers of the Karzai regime, the cronies that he had in place there, and the allied warlords. I mean, it was very famous that the largest arms and drug smuggler in the country was Hamid Karzai's brother, Ahmad Wali Karzai. All of this was well known. And these huge villas being constructed in Kabul in the face of people becoming poorer and poorer. And of course, your viewers will know one of the main mantras even at that time was, well, we have to go in there to liberate Afghan women, improve the situation of Afghan women who were, of course, suffering tremendously under the Taliban. But even on that front, in fact, in many parts of the country, situation has become even worse. I mean, in some parts of Kabul, sure, you have some schools and so on, but in large parts of the country, nothing has improved for even Afghan women. So all of the kind of pretexts that were used to go into Afghanistan collapsed immediately, and it became very clear that this was simply a horrible, arrogant, and brutal occupation accompanied by a local client regime which was just looking out for its making money and protecting its power and privileges at the expense of the plight of the majority of the Afghan population.
So what does Afghanistan now look like? I know, very basic infrastructure in terms of water, sanitation, electricity, were all plans that President Obama had for Afghanistan that he promised to deliver on. But when you speak to Afghans on the ground, you see none of that has actually transpired. Only large bags of cement still sitting in some of the airports, hardened by the promise of the U.S.
Absolutely right. I mean, it's really scandalous because still most of the country is run by local warlords allied to the regime in Kabul, and they are interested in protecting their little fiefdoms and maintaining their power and privileges. And the U.S. And NATO occupation has been more than fine with that. They simply provide the support for these very reactionary, equally fundamentalist forces throughout the country to maintain those fiefdoms. They do nothing to kind of alter that arrangement in the country. And the only thing they are concerned with is that the resistance forces in Afghanistan, whether they come under the guys of the Taliban or any other group are completely squashed, and any communities throughout the country that are suspected of quote unquote harboring or having such elements, they are subject to collective punishment. So it's that concern which has driven both the US NATO occupation forces and it's the allied regime in Kabul, which has overridden any other concern for social development and so on and so forth. So, then it doesn't, take much intelligence to figure out why the majority of the Afghan population then wants to resist this occupation and takes up arms. And of course, now they often even get frustrated with the more moderate elements of the Taliban who want to enter into peace negotiations, some type of reconciliation agreement with the Kabul government, and instead are attracted to more radical forms of resistance, such as ISIS, which has now emerged in the country.
Now, one of the proposals from various peace organizations has been to bring all parties, all concerned to the table for some regional solution to what Afghans face. What does a proposal like that look like, and who's sitting at the table for a real solution, a regional solution to the issues of Afghans?
Exactly, and see, this is the problem. I mean, in such an approach would lie the possibility of a solution that is getting together all parties involved, and those are the regional actors, because every one of these factions within Afghanistan has some outside backer. Of course, what is largely focused on and obsessed with by the Western media is the Taliban and its Pakistan backer. That the Pakistani establishment and the intelligence services continue to support the Taliban, and so on and so forth. And there's obviously there's truth in that. But of course, what is not spoken about is all of the other players as well. Elements of the former Northern Alliance continue to be supported by Russia, India, and so on. Of course, the US's own involvement, and of course, then there are the Iranians. So it's clear that everyone has had a horse in the race in Afghanistan. And all of these outside powers must be compelled to be brought to the negotiating table to tell the factions that they're supporting to stop the violence, to disarm, and to come to the negotiating table. Only asking, say, the Pakistanis to stop supporting the Taliban is not going to work. It's very disingenuous and hypocritical, and your viewers may remember the US would say this often when it was occupying Iraq, and it still is to some extent, but that foreign forces should not be interfering in the country. And of course it was referring to, say, the Syrians or the Iranians in Iraq, meanwhile having tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of troops and American mercenaries being stationed there. So this type of rhetoric is not taken seriously. All foreign countries involved in Afghanistan must come to the table, must ask the groups they're supporting to stop the violence, to disarm, and come to the table to negotiate a settlement in Afghanistan which recognizes the diversity, the diverse groups of Afghanistan, and tries to come up with some type of a plan that grants autonomy. Only in such a solution would there lie kind of the long-term ability of some stability, some political setup to remain sustainable in Afghanistan.
And is there any proposal on the table as such?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're right. I mean, it's coming more from the more sensible analysts, civil society groups that recognize what's going on. The problem that comes from the major state actors, particularly, say, the United States, is say, they don't want other forces involved, such as the Pakistanis, or the Russians may not want the Pakistanis involved, the Indians. may not want them involved. So all of these individual states are very skeptical towards the other states that are supporting some force in Afghanistan, which it prevents them from all coming to the table. Now China is a major player there as well, and the United States doesn't really want it to be involved in
And
such.
how are they involved?
Well, the Chinese now are probably the single largest investor in Afghanistan, and it was India for a while, but now the Chinese have surpassed them. So they are also very active in kind of investment in the country, in development, and so on. So all these players have some stake in Afghanistan. And I think that it is the kind of narrow parochial, particularly this security lens through which the US and NATO forces in particular look at Afghanistan that prevents some type of a meaningful solution that brings all parties to the table.
And Junaid, my last question to you is, do you remember that scheme that President Obama had talked about when he took office as to how he was going to speak to both the Pakistanis and the Indians in terms of bringing about some sort of a peace proposal between them over the Northern Territory that they are still in conflict over, and that measure would free up Indian forces to be able to go to Afghanistan, and somehow he saw a solution there. Do you remember that? And if so, what has happened to it?
Yeah, and of course, Obama hasn't been the first one to do that, but the second anyone, including a U.S. president, invokes the possibility of playing such a role, New Delhi becomes outraged. And the U.S.-India relationship is a very close one. The U.S. also needs India in its containment of China, in its East pivot to Asia policy, and so on. So it didn't bother New Delhi much about making any movement in resolving the issue of Kashmir and improving ties with Pakistan and so on, because it was largely concerned with having India as a close ally against China. And that continues to be the case. And of course, this is incredibly provocative towards Pakistan, which is why Pakistan doesn't back down in continuing to support the Taliban in Afghanistan. It's all very clear. All the major regional powers, though, have their own vested interests and therefore aren't taking the steps. In fact, are doing the opposite to create more instability, more chaos, and more violence in Afghanistan.
Junaid S. Ahmad, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.